When I discovered my husband Alexander was having secret Tuesday dinners with another woman, I didn't confront him. Instead, I made a reservation at the same restaurant for the very next table. What I witnessed that night, and what I did about it, changed everything. By the time dessert arrived, his carefully constructed lies were crumbling faster than the chocolate soufflé on his plate.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're a subscriber, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Tell us a duh.
The crystal chandelier at Marcello's cast dancing shadows across table 12 as I watched my husband of 8 years lean across the intimate corner booth, his fingers intertwined with those of a woman who wasn't me. Talitha Hackett, his so-called project coordinator, threw her head back in laughter at something Alexander whispered, her auburn hair catching the warm restaurant lighting like spun copper. I sat precisely 18 inches away at table 11, hidden behind an oversized menu and a strategic floral arrangement, my heart hammering against my ribs as I documented their Tuesday night ritual with the tiny camera I'd purchased specifically for this purpose. This wasn't my first surveillance mission. For 6 weeks, I'd been tracking their pattern. Every Tuesday at 7:30 p.m., Marcello's Italian Bistro became their romantic sanctuary. "More wine?" Alexander asked Tabitha, his voice carrying that tender tone I hadn't heard directed at me in over 2 years. The same voice that once read me poetry during our college years, that whispered sweet promises during our wedding ceremony at St. Catherine's Cathedral. Tabitha nodded, extending her glass with a practiced grace that suggested this wasn't their second bottle, but their second dozen. "You know exactly what I like," she purred, and I watched my husband's face transform into an expression of pure adoration. The same expression he'd worn when proposing to me on the Santa Monica Pier 8 years ago, complete with the nervous smile and slightly flushed cheeks. I adjusted my position slightly, ensuring my phone camera captured the moment Alexander reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. Not just any box, the distinctive burgundy velvet of Tiffany & Co. My breath caught in my throat as Tabitha gasped with theatrical surprise, as if she hadn't been expecting this moment during their regular Tuesday rendezvous. "Alexander, is this what I think it is?" she asked, her voice pitched perfectly between shock and delight. The performance was flawless, except I knew it was exactly that, a performance. Because 3 weeks ago, I'd found the jewelry store receipt in his car's glove compartment, dated 2 months prior. This proposal had been planned longer than our last vacation. "Tabitha, these past 8 months have been the happiest of my life," Alexander began, and I felt something cold and sharp twist in my stomach. 8 months. Their affair predated every major milestone we'd celebrated recently. Our wedding anniversary dinner in March, where he toasted to many more years of happiness. My promotion celebration in April, where he'd been conspicuously absent due to a client emergency. The birthday party I'd thrown for his mother in May, where Tabitha had attended as a colleague, and I'd actually served her cake. The small camera trembled in my hands as I watched him slide a diamond ring onto her finger. Not just any diamond, a 2-carat emerald-cut stone that cost more than my annual teacher salary. I knew because I'd seen the receipt. $28,000 charged to our joint credit card, the one I'd foolishly trusted him to manage for our shared expenses. "Mrs. Thatcher," the server's voice startled me from my surveillance trance. "Would you like to see our dessert menu?" I'd made the reservation under my maiden name, ensuring Alexander wouldn't connect table 11 with his wife Carol, even if the hostess mentioned it. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was using my pre-marriage identity to uncover the truth about my marriage's destruction. "Actually," I said, my voice steadier than I felt, "I'd like to send a bottle of champagne to table 12, your finest vintage. Tell them it's from someone who appreciates true love when she sees it." The server nodded enthusiastically, clearly charmed by what appeared to be a romantic gesture from a stranger. He had no idea he was about to become an unwitting participant in the most calculated moment of my life. As the champagne arrived at their table, I watched Alexander's confusion transform to concern, then to barely concealed panic as his eyes swept the restaurant. He knew. Somehow, despite all his careful planning and elaborate deception, he knew someone was watching. His gaze skipped over table 11 3 times, dismissing the lone woman hidden behind her menu as just another solitary diner in a restaurant full of couples. Tabitha raised her champagne flute, the new diamond catching the light like a disco ball. "To new beginnings," she toasted, her voice carrying across the intimate space. "To new beginnings," I whispered, raising my own wine glass in a mock toast they couldn't see. Because tonight wasn't ending the way Alexander and Tabitha expected. Tonight was just the beginning of a very different story, one where the betrayed wife wasn't the victim, but the author of her own justice. I'd spent 6 weeks documenting their Tuesday night routine, learning their favorite dishes, their usual seating preferences, even the way Alexander always ordered the same Barolo wine. But more importantly, I'd spent 6 weeks planning exactly how this revelation would unfold. The engagement ring was just the opening act. The real show would begin when I stood up, walked to their table, and introduced myself properly. Because while they'd been falling in love over expensive Italian dinners, I'd been falling out of love with the man I thought I knew and into something far more powerful. The absolute certainty that I deserved better, and I was about to make sure everyone in Marcello's knew it too. The truth was about to be served, and it would be far more bitter than their after-dinner espresso. 2 months earlier, I had been the picture of a contented wife, carefully curating our life with the same attention to detail I brought to my 5th grade classroom at Riverside Elementary. Our craftsman-style home on Maple Street was a testament to 8 years of shared dreams. The herb garden Alexander had helped me plant during our 2nd year of marriage, the built-in bookshelves he'd designed for my teaching materials, the vintage chandelier we'd found together at an estate sale in Pasadena. Every surface told the story of a couple building something beautiful together. Wedding photos from our ceremony at St. Catherine's Cathedral lined the hallway, capturing moments of genuine joy that now felt like evidence from someone else's life. The kitchen island displayed carefully arranged family photos. Alexander and me hiking in Yosemite, our trip to his cousin Jeremy's wedding in Portland, last Christmas with my parents at their lake house in Michigan. I had been so proud of our life. My colleagues at Riverside Elementary often commented on how devoted Alexander seemed, how he always remembered to send flowers on important days, how he'd surprise me with lunch during my planning period. "You're so lucky," my friend Gabrielle Sweeney would say. "Stephen never thinks to do things like that." The irony cut deep now, knowing that Alexander's attentiveness had been guilt-driven compensation for his Tuesday night betrayals. Our morning routine had become a choreographed performance of marital contentment. Alexander would wake at 6:15, shower while I prepared coffee and his favorite breakfast, steel-cut oats with fresh berries and a drizzle of honey. He'd emerge from the bathroom smelling of his signature cologne, the same Tom Ford fragrance I'd given him for our 5th anniversary, looking every inch the successful architect in his tailored suits. "What's your day look like, beautiful?" he'd ask, the same question every morning, delivered with a kiss to my temple as he reached for his briefcase. "Parent conferences until 4, then I'm grading the science fair projects," I'd reply, straightening his tie with the automatic gesture of a practiced wife. "Dinner at 7? Perfect, I'll pick up wine on the way home." The conversation never varied. We'd settled into the comfortable predictability that marriage advice columns always warned against, but I'd interpreted our routine as evidence of a solid partnership. Alexander knew exactly how I liked my coffee: 2 sugars, splash of cream. I knew he'd preferred his suits hung immediately after dry cleaning to prevent wrinkles. We moved around each other in our kitchen like dancers who'd rehearsed the same performance for years. But I'd been dancing alone while he played a completely different song. The first crack in our perfect facade appeared on a Tuesday in early March. Alexander's architectural firm, Thatcher and Associates, was celebrating the completion of their biggest project, a luxury hotel complex in downtown Los Angeles.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The celebration dinner was planned for Tuesday night at the Continental Club, and I'd spent hours selecting the perfect dress, a midnight blue silk number that Alexander had always complimented. At 5:30 p.m., just as I was applying the finishing touches to my makeup, my phone buzzed with a text. Emergency at the Portland site. Flying out tonight, rain check on dinner. I stared at the message, confusion clouding my excitement. The Portland project had been completed 6 months ago. I'd attended the completion ceremony myself, watched Alexander give a speech about architectural vision and community building. But marriage, I reminded myself, required trust. Surely there could be follow-up issues, warranty concerns, client complaints. Of course, I texted back. Safe travels, love you. His response came immediately. Love you too, don't wait up. I spent that Tuesday evening alone, eating leftover Chinese takeout in my carefully chosen dress, scrolling through social media photos from the Continental Club celebration. Photo after photo showed Alexander's colleagues enjoying cocktails and dinner. Morty Dubs from accounting posted a group shot of the entire firm leadership team. Alexander wasn't among them. But Tabitha Hackett was. She wore a stunning red dress and stood in the exact spot I should have occupied, next to the empty chair that should have been Alexander's. I told myself there was a logical explanation. Alexander must have missed the dinner due to his travel emergency. Tabitha was probably attending as his representative, keeping his seat warm until he returned. I created elaborate narratives to explain away the inconsistency, because the alternative, that my husband had lied about a work emergency to avoid attending a celebration with me, was too painful to consider. The pattern established itself with surgical precision. Tuesday became Alexander's night for client emergencies, site visits, and investor dinners. Always apologetic, always last minute, always with reasonable explanations that dissolved under scrutiny only if I chose to examine them closely. I didn't choose to examine them. Instead, I filled Tuesday evenings with productive activities. I joined a book club with other teachers from Riverside Elementary. I started taking pottery classes at the community center. I convinced myself that having separate interests strengthened our marriage, that couples needed space to grow individually. Meanwhile, Alexander began leaving the house each Tuesday afternoon, smelling like he'd bathed in cologne. His Tuesday morning showers grew longer, more elaborate. He'd spend extra time styling his hair, choosing his clothes with unusual care for someone attending site visits or client meetings. "You look handsome," I tell him, and his smile would falter for just a moment before returning with renewed brightness. "Just want to make a good impression on the investors," he'd reply, but his eyes wouldn't quite meet mine. The lies were becoming easier for him to tell and harder for me to believe. But belief, I was learning, was as much about what you chose to see as what was actually there. And I had chosen to see a devoted husband working hard to build our future, even when the evidence suggested I was looking at a man building an exit strategy from our marriage. The first Tuesday in April brought an unseasonably warm evening and an unusual request from Alexander. He needed the credit card for a client dinner at an upscale restaurant, something about impressing potential investors for the firm's next project. Nothing unusual there, except for the way he avoided eye contact when asking, and the fact that he'd never needed to specifically request our card for business expenses before. "Which restaurant?" I asked casually while grading spelling tests at the kitchen table. "Marcello's," he replied, already reaching for his keys. "That new Italian place downtown, supposed to have excellent wine." I made a mental note. Marcello's wasn't particularly new. It had been opened for over 2 years. We'd even driven past it several times, with me suggesting we try it for our anniversary last year. Alexander had dismissed it then as overpriced and pretentious. That night, I found myself Googling the restaurant's menu and reading reviews, telling myself I was just curious about where my husband was dining for business. The photos showed intimate lighting, small tables perfect for couples, and a wine list that would indeed impress investors. But something nagged at me, a feeling I couldn't quite name. 2 weeks later, the credit card statement arrived. The Marcello's charge was there, but it wasn't the amount that caught my attention. It was the timestamp, 8:47 p.m. for the initial charge, then a second charge at 10:23 p.m. Two separate transactions at the same restaurant, both for amounts that suggested dinner for two, not a business meeting with multiple investors. I stared at the statement, creating innocent explanations. Maybe they'd needed to move tables. Perhaps they'd ordered additional wine or dessert separately. Business dinners could run long, especially when courting important clients. But the doubt had taken root. The following Tuesday, I decided to work late at school, organizing my classroom library and updating bulletin boards. At 8:30 p.m., I called Alexander to check in. His phone went straight to voicemail. I tried again at 9:15, then 9:45. Each call went unanswered. When he arrived home at 11:20 p.m., I was reading in bed, pretending casual interest in his evening. "How was the client dinner?" I asked, not looking up from my book. "Exhausting," he replied, loosening his tie. "These investors are demanding, want to see every detail of the project timeline." "Where did you take them?" "That steakhouse on Wilshire. Morton's, I think. Decent food, but the service was slow." I nodded and returned to my book, but my mind was racing. Morton's was nowhere near where Alexander's phone had pinged when I'd tried calling. I knew because I'd checked the location services on our shared family plan afterward, telling myself I was just worried about his safety when he didn't answer. His phone had been in the vicinity of downtown, near Marcello's. The pattern crystallized over the following weeks. Every Tuesday, Alexander's phone would be unreachable between 7:30 and 11 p.m. Every Wednesday morning, he'd volunteer elaborate details about his previous evening's business dinner, details that became more specific and less believable with each telling. "The Portland investors loved the concept," he'd say, buttering his toast with unusual enthusiasm. "We're talking about expanding the project to include retail space." But Portland was a completed project. There were no investors to meet, no expansions to plan. I began keeping a small notebook, documenting the inconsistencies without fully acknowledging what I was doing. Tuesday, April 15th. Claims dinner with Seattle clients. Phone located downtown. Wednesday, April 16th. Mentions specific restaurant details that don't match credit card charges. Thursday, April 17th. New cologne in bathroom, never worn around me. The cologne discovery shook me more than the location discrepancies or timeline inconsistencies. Alexander had worn the same Tom Ford fragrance for our entire marriage. I'd given it to him for our first Christmas together, and he'd repurchased it faithfully ever since. But Thursday morning, I caught a different scent lingering in our bathroom, something woody and expensive, with notes I didn't recognize. When I mentioned it over breakfast, Alexander's fork paused halfway to his mouth. "Oh, that," he said, resuming eating with forced casualness. "Jeremy recommended it. Thought I should try something new." Jeremy Mulligan, Alexander's college roommate, lived in Chicago and worked in finance. They spoke maybe twice a year. The idea that Jeremy was suddenly offering fragrance advice seemed unlikely. But I smiled and nodded, adding another entry to my growing notebook of inconsistencies. The final piece of my mounting suspicion came from an unexpected source, my student Anna Thatcher's mother. During a parent conference in late April, Mrs. Thatcher mentioned seeing my husband at Marcello's the previous evening. "Such a romantic restaurant," she said with a knowing smile. "You two looked so happy together. Though I have to say, your hair looked completely different. I almost didn't recognize you." I felt the color drain from my face. Tuesday evening, 7:45 p.m., I had been at home grading math assessments. Alexander had been at Marcello's with someone who wasn't me, someone Mrs. Thatcher had mistaken for me in the dim restaurant lighting. "Oh," I managed to say, my voice sounding distant to my own ears, "you must have mistaken us for another couple." Mrs. Thatcher's smile faltered slightly. "No, I'm quite certain it was Alexander. He waved when he saw me. Lovely auburn-haired woman with him, very elegant." auburn hair. I had brown hair, shoulder length, and practical. Whoever Alexander had been with was definitely not his wife. That night, I lay awake listening to Alexander's peaceful breathing beside me, my mind churning through months of Tuesday night absences, unexplained charges, and elaborate lies about business dinners that were clearly something else entirely. The husband sleeping next to me wasn't the man I thought I'd married. He was someone else entirely, someone capable of sustained deception, someone living a double life with practiced ease. The question wasn't whether Alexander was having an affair. The question was how long it had been going on and what I was going to do about it. 9 years earlier, I had been a 26-year-old first-year teacher at Riverside Elementary, idealistic and overwhelmed in equal measure. My classroom was a disaster zone of mismatched furniture, outdated textbooks, and a heating system that seemed to operate on its own mysterious schedule. The building itself was nearly 60 years old, and my room's windows hadn't been properly sealed since the Carter administration. Alexander Thatcher arrived on a Tuesday morning in October, carrying blueprints and wearing a tool belt that made him look like a character from a romantic comedy. The school district had finally allocated funds for building improvements, and Thatcher and Associates had won the contract for renovating the elementary school's aging infrastructure. "Sorry for the disruption," he said, knocking on my open classroom door during my planning period. "I need to assess the window situation in here. Should only take a few minutes." He had kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and a smile that seemed genuinely apologetic about interrupting my work. While my 22 third graders were at PE, he measured windows and examined the ancient heating vents, occasionally muttering about thermal efficiency and energy waste. "How long have these windows been leaking?" he asked, running his hand along a frame where I'd strategically placed a small bucket to catch drips during rainstorms. "Probably since before I was born," I replied, not looking up from the math worksheets I was grading. "The maintenance staff just tells us to work around it." Alexander frowned, making notes on his clipboard. "That's not acceptable. Kids deserve better learning environments." Something in his tone made me look up. He wasn't just assessing building defects, he was genuinely concerned about my students' comfort and education. In my limited experience with contractors, most seemed focused on completing jobs quickly and cheaply. Alexander appeared to care about the actual people who would live with his work. Over the following weeks, as renovation work progressed throughout the building, Alexander would stop by my classroom during lunch breaks or planning periods. Initially, these visits were professional, updating me on timeline changes or asking about specific needs for classroom functionality. But gradually, our conversations expanded beyond construction schedules. "What are you reading?" he asked one afternoon, noticing the novel on my desk. "To Kill a Mockingbird," I replied. "We're doing a unit on courage and standing up for what's right, though I'm not sure third graders are ready for some of the heavier themes." Alexander picked up the book, running his thumb along the worn cover. "I haven't read this since high school. I remember thinking Atticus Finch was the kind of man I wanted to become." "And did you?" The question slipped out before I could stop it, more personal than our usual exchanges. He considered this seriously, setting the book down carefully. "I'm working on it. Some days are better than others." That conversation marked a shift in our dynamic. Alexander began bringing coffee during his visits, a perfect vanilla latte from the cafe down the street, exactly the way I'd mentioned liking it during a casual conversation about morning routines. He'd ask about my students' progress, remember names of kids I'd mentioned having trouble with reading or math. When 8-year-old Morty Dubbs finally mastered long division after weeks of struggle, Alexander was the first person I wanted to share the news with. When Anna Sweeney's parents went through a difficult divorce and she started acting out in class, Alexander listened patiently as I worried about how to help her process her emotions. "You care about these kids like they're your own," he observed one afternoon as I stayed late creating individualized reading plans for struggling students. "They are mine," I said. "For 8 hours a day, I'm responsible for their safety, their growth, their confidence. That's not a responsibility I take lightly." Alexander nodded, understanding immediately. "My father thinks I should be building commercial properties, maximizing profit margins. But I love residential work because I'm creating spaces where people build their lives. Seems like we're both in the business of caring about people's futures." Our first official date happened almost by accident. Alexander had finished installing new windows in my classroom, and I'd offered to buy him dinner as a thank you gesture. We went to a small Mexican restaurant near the school, planning to grab quick tacos and part ways. Instead, we talked for 3 hours. He told me about growing up in his father's construction business, learning to swing a hammer before he could properly tie his shoes, about studying architecture in college while his father pressured him to join the family firm immediately, about his dream of designing sustainable, affordable housing that could strengthen communities rather than just generate profit. I shared stories about why I'd become a teacher, about the mentor who'd encouraged me to see education as a form of social justice, about my students who came to school hungry, whose parents worked multiple jobs, who needed someone to believe in their potential when circumstances suggested limited possibilities. Alexander nodded, understanding immediately. My father thinks I should be building commercial properties, maximizing profit margins. But I love residential work because I'm creating spaces where people build their lives. Seems like we're both in the business of caring about people's futures. Our first official date happened almost by accident. Alexander had finished installing new windows in my classroom, and I'd offered to buy him dinner as a thank you gesture. We went to a small Mexican restaurant near the school, planning to grab quick tacos and part ways. Instead, we talked for 3 hours. He told me about growing up in his father's construction business, learning to swing a hammer before he could properly tie his shoes, about studying architecture in college while his father pressured him to join the family firm immediately, about his dream of designing sustainable, affordable housing that could strengthen communities rather than just generate profit. I shared stories about why I'd become a teacher, about the mentor who'd encouraged me to see education as a form of social justice, about my students who came to school hungry, whose parents worked multiple jobs, who needed someone to believe in their potential when circumstances suggested limited possibilities.
You're changing the world one kid at a time, Alexander said as we walked to our cars that evening. That's remarkable. No one had ever described my teaching that way. Most people saw elementary education as babysitting with lesson plans, not as meaningful work that could transform lives. Alexander understood immediately that my classroom was where I fought for every child's future. Our relationship developed with the same careful attention Alexander brought to his architectural projects. He designed our dates around my teaching schedule, planning weekend activities that would help me recharge for the week ahead. When I mentioned wanting to visit the Getty Museum's Education Center, he spent hours researching their teacher resources and special exhibitions. For my birthday, he didn't buy jewelry or flowers. Instead, he built custom bookshelves for my apartment, perfectly sized for my growing collection of children's literature and educational resources. The craftsmanship was beautiful, but what moved me was his attention to my needs. Adjustable shelves for different book sizes, a small reading nook at child height, even a special section for the books I read aloud to classes. This is the most thoughtful gift anyone's ever given me, I told him as we arranged books on the new shelves. You light up when you talk about teaching, he replied. I wanted to build something that honored that passion. 6 months later, when Alexander proposed in my newly organized classroom, surrounded by the bookshelves he'd built and the windows he'd installed, it felt like the natural culmination of a love story built on mutual respect and shared values. I want to spend my life building things that matter, he said, down on one knee between the reading corner and my desk, starting with a life together. I said yes without hesitation, certain I'd found a partner who would always see my work, my dreams, and my value clearly. The man kneeling before me understood that love was built through daily acts of attention and care, not grand gestures or expensive gifts. Looking back now, I wondered when that man had disappeared and been replaced by someone capable of elaborate Tuesday night deceptions. The Alexander who had once built bookshelves to honor my teaching passion was now lying about business dinners while buying engagement rings for other women. The foundation of trust we'd built over years of small, consistent acts of love had been eroded by months of betrayal I was only beginning to understand. The transformation didn't happen overnight. Like coastal erosion, it was so gradual that I didn't notice the solid ground beneath our marriage disappearing until I was standing on a cliff edge, looking down at jagged rocks where a beautiful beach used to be.
The first shift came 18 months after our wedding when Alexander's father, Stanley Thatcher, offered him a partnership in the family business. Stanley had built Thatcher and Associates from a small residential contractor into one of Los Angeles County's most successful commercial development firms. The partnership came with a corner office, a substantial salary increase, and expectations that would fundamentally change who Alexander was. "It's everything we've worked for," Alexander said over dinner at our kitchen table, the same table where he'd once sketched house plans on napkins. Financial security, professional respect, the chance to build something lasting. I supported the decision wholeheartedly. Alexander had always felt pressure to prove himself worthy of his father's business empire. The partnership represented validation of his talents and a path toward the financial stability we'd need for our future family. What I didn't anticipate was how completely Alexander would have to remake himself to fit Stanley's vision of a successful businessman. The first casualty was his wardrobe. The casual button-downs and khakis that had suited an on-site architect were replaced by expensive suits from Nordstrom. Alexander spent more on a single tie than I spent on a week's worth of groceries. When I gently questioned the necessity of such expensive clothes, he bristled. "Image matters in commercial development," he said, adjusting his new silk tie in our bedroom mirror. "Clients need to see success when they look at me." The bookshelves he'd built for our apartment, filled with architecture journals, sustainability texts, and community planning guides, were gradually replaced by business publications. Harvard Business Review, Commercial Property Executive, and investment magazines lined the shelves where books about green building practices used to sit. Our conversations began shifting, too. Instead of discussing interesting projects or design challenges, Alexander talked about profit margins, investor relations, and market positioning. The passionate architect who had once described buildings as poems written in steel and stone was replaced by someone who spoke about square footage optimization and revenue generation potential. The change accelerated when Alexander started working on high-profile commercial projects. The first was a luxury shopping center in Beverly Hills, a project that required extensive client entertainment and relationship building. Suddenly, Alexander's evenings were filled with networking events, client dinners, and weekend golf tournaments at exclusive country clubs. "It's temporary," he assured me when I mentioned missing our quiet Sunday mornings together. "Once we establish these relationships, things will settle down." But settling down never happened. Each successful project led to larger ones, requiring more intensive client management and social obligations. Alexander joined the Wilshire Country Club, started attending charity galas for causes he'd never previously cared about, and developed friendships with people whose names appeared regularly in Los Angeles Magazine's society pages. I tried to adapt, buying appropriate dresses for the corporate events Alexander occasionally invited me to attend. But I felt like an imposter in those rooms full of people discussing vacation homes in Aspen and private school strategies for children they hadn't even had yet. My stories about classroom victories and student breakthroughs seemed quaint and irrelevant compared to conversations about stock portfolios and real estate investments. "You don't seem to enjoy these events," Alexander observed after a particularly awkward evening at Stanley's firm anniversary party. "I feel out of place," I admitted. "These aren't really my people." Alexander's response stung more than he probably intended. "Maybe you could make an effort to fit in better. It would help my career if my wife could connect with clients' wives." The implication was clear. I was becoming a liability to his professional advancement rather than an asset. Our physical intimacy began deteriorating around the same time. Alexander's work stress increased dramatically as he took on more responsibility at the firm. He'd come home exhausted, distracted by problems I couldn't help solve because I didn't understand the business complexities involved. Our conversations became functional rather than meaningful, coordinating schedules, discussing household logistics, sharing surface-level updates about our separate worlds. The spontaneous affection that had characterized our early marriage disappeared. Alexander stopped leaving sweet notes in my lunch bag, stopped bringing me flowers just because, stopped initiating the kinds of deep conversations that had originally drawn us together. When I tried to recreate some of our old rituals, like cooking elaborate Sunday dinners or exploring new neighborhoods together, Alexander seemed restless and distracted. Work is really demanding right now became his standard explanation for everything from missed dinners to forgotten anniversaries. The miscarriage during our 4th year of marriage created a chasm that we never properly addressed. I was devastated, not just by the loss of our baby, but by the loss of the future we'd been planning. Alexander's response was to throw himself even deeper into work, treating grief like an inconvenient scheduling conflict that could be managed through increased productivity. "We can try again when things are less crazy at the office," he said, 2 weeks after the miscarriage, as if conception could be scheduled around quarterly business reviews. I needed to process the loss, to mourn what we'd lost and what it meant for our future. Alexander needed to avoid thinking about it entirely. The emotional distance that developed during those months never fully closed. By our 6th year of marriage, we were living parallel lives that occasionally intersected around practical necessities. Alexander's world was filled with client meetings, business trips, and networking events. My world revolved around my students, my teacher friends, and the small suburban routines that kept our household functioning. We still attended family gatherings together, still presented ourselves as a happy couple to the outside world, but privately, we were becoming strangers who shared a mortgage and a last name, but little else. The Tuesday night business dinners started during our 7th year, initially seeming like just another extension of Alexander's expanding professional obligations. But unlike his other work commitments, these dinners made him genuinely happy. He'd return home energized and talkative in ways that reminded me of the early days of our relationship. "How was dinner?" I'd ask, genuinely pleased to see him animated about something. "Productive," he'd say, but his smile suggested it had been more than just productive, really productive. I was so grateful for any sign of the enthusiastic, engaged Alexander I'd fallen in love with that I didn't question why business dinners had suddenly become such a source of joy for him. I didn't wonder why he'd started caring about his appearance again, why he'd begun whistling while getting dressed for these particular work obligations. I was so starved for glimpses of my husband's happiness that I failed to recognize the signs that his happiness was coming from someone else entirely. The man I'd married, the one who built bookshelves and cared about sustainable architecture, had been gradually replaced by someone whose priorities, interests, and affections lay elsewhere. By the time I realized what was happening, the erosion was nearly complete. The smoking gun arrived on a Thursday morning in May, wrapped in the mundane routine of laundry day. I was sorting through Alexander's shirts before taking them to the dry cleaner when I found it, tucked deep in the breast pocket of his navy Hugo Boss suit, the one he'd worn to Tuesday's investor dinner. A receipt from Marcello's Italian Bistro. Timestamp, 8:47 p.m. Table for two. Total, $347.82. My hands trembled as I studied the small slip of thermal paper. The amount was staggering, nearly $350 for a single dinner. But more damning than the price was the itemization. 2 appetizers, 2 entrees, a bottle of Barolo wine that cost more than my weekly grocery budget, and creme brulee for dessert. 2 of everything, a romantic dinner for 2, charged to our joint credit card while I sat at home grading science fair projects. I sank onto our bed, the receipt burning in my fingers like evidence of a crime. Because that's what this was, a crime against our marriage, our trust, our shared financial future. Alexander had spent nearly $350 entertaining another woman while lying to me about business meetings and investor presentations. But the receipt revealed something even more devastating than the financial betrayal. At the bottom, in faded ink, was a handwritten note from the server. "Happy anniversary! Complimentary champagne for the lovely couple." Anniversary. They were celebrating an anniversary. My vision blurred as the implications hit me. This wasn't a casual affair or a recent indiscretion. Alexander and whoever he was dining with had a relationship significant enough to commemorate with anniversary celebrations. They had history, milestones, shared memories that didn't include me. I photographed the receipt with my phone, then carefully returned it to Alexander's pocket exactly as I'd found it. My hands moved automatically through the motions of sorting laundry, but my mind was reeling. How long had they been together? What anniversary were they celebrating? The first time they met? Their first kiss? The first time they slept together? The questions multiplied like a virus, infecting every memory of our recent marriage. How many Tuesday nights had I spent alone while Alexander celebrated romantic milestones with another woman? How many times had he come home to me with the taste of her lips still on his mouth? That afternoon, I called in sick to school for the first time in 3 years. I couldn't face my fifth graders while my world was crumbling. Instead, I drove aimlessly through neighborhoods we'd once explored together, trying to process the magnitude of Alexander's deception. By evening, I'd made a decision. Confronting Alexander with a single receipt would give him the opportunity to explain it away, to minimize the evidence, to craft a story that would make me doubt my own perceptions. I'd learned enough about his capacity for elaborate lies to know he'd have a ready explanation. Instead, I would investigate. I would gather irrefutable evidence before revealing what I knew. Knowledge was power, and I needed all the power I could accumulate before this marriage exploded. My first stop was our home office, where Alexander kept financial records in a filing cabinet he assumed I never accessed. I'd always left money management to him, trusting his business background and mathematical skills. That trust now seemed like willful blindness. The credit card statements told a story I'd been too naive to read. Marcello's appeared regularly, every Tuesday for the past 4 months. Always the same timestamp, always charges for 2 people, always expensive enough to suggest celebration rather than mere sustenance. But Marcello's wasn't the only recurring charge. There were jewelry purchases from Tiffany & Co., flower deliveries from Beverly Hills florists, weekend hotel stays at luxury resorts when Alexander claimed to be visiting construction sites. The financial trail of infidelity was extensive and expensive. I calculated the total spending on what I now understood were affair-related expenses. Over $15,000 in 6 months. Money from our joint account, money we'd saved for a down payment on a larger house, money I'd contributed through my teaching salary and careful budgeting. Alexander hadn't just betrayed our marriage vows, he'd stolen from our shared future to finance his relationship with another woman. The hotel charges were particularly painful. Weekend getaways to Santa Barbara, Carmel, and San Diego, all places Alexander had claimed to be visiting for business, places we'd talked about exploring together but never seemed to find time for. He'd been finding time, just not with me. I printed and organized every suspicious charge, creating a timeline of deception that stretched back further than I'd imagined. The Tuesday dinners were just the tip of an iceberg that included regular weekend trips, expensive gifts, and romantic gestures I hadn't received in years. As I worked through the financial records, a memory surfaced that made my stomach lurch. 3 months ago, Alexander had mentioned casually that the firm was considering expanding their Santa Barbara project. He'd need to make several site visits to assess the coastal building requirements. Rough assignment, I'd joked. Someone has to suffer through weekends in Santa Barbara. Alexander had smiled and agreed it was a sacrifice he was willing to make for the firm's success. The hotel charges revealed the truth. Those weren't site visits. They were romantic getaways, charged to our credit card while I stayed home believing my husband was working weekends to secure our financial future. The pattern was consistent and devastating. Every business trip, every client dinner, every work emergency that had separated us over the past 6 months had been a lie. Alexander wasn't building our future, he was systematically dismantling it while constructing a new life with someone else. By 10 p.m., when Alexander returned from his latest client meeting, I had assembled a comprehensive dossier of his infidelity, financial records, timeline documentation, and photographic evidence of receipts and charges that told the story of a double life. "How was your evening?" I asked, as he hung his jacket in our closet, my voice steady despite the hurricane of emotions churning inside me. "Productive," he replied, the same word he always used. "Very productive." I nodded and smiled, the same response I always gave. But internally, I was no longer the trusting wife who accepted his explanations without question. I was someone else entirely, someone who understood that knowledge was power and patience was a weapon. Alexander had been planning this deception for months. Now it was my turn to plan. The receipt in his jacket pocket had been my awakening. Now I needed to discover who he was buying $350 dinners for, where they went on their romantic weekends, and how long this anniversary-worthy relationship had been developing behind my back. Tomorrow, I would begin the real investigation. Tonight, I would sleep next to my husband one last time, as the woman who trusted him completely. By morning, I would be someone entirely different, someone who understood that love without vigilance was just another word for vulnerability. The evidence was hidden in a locked box beneath our bed, inches from where Alexander slept peacefully, dreaming of whatever future he was planning that didn't include me. But he had no idea that his carefully constructed double life was about to be exposed by the wife he'd underestimated completely. The breakthrough came through social media, of all places. 3 days after discovering the Marcello's receipt, I was scrolling through Instagram during my lunch break when I saw her. The woman from my nightmares, the face I'd been trying to construct from fragments of evidence and imagination. Tabitha Hackett's profile wasn't private. Marketing professionals rarely made that mistake. Their online presence was part of their personal brand. Her bio read, Senior Marketing Director at Thatcher Associates, wine enthusiast, sunset chaser, living my best life. The irony of her working at Alexander's firm wasn't lost on me. This wasn't some random woman he'd met at a bar or through a dating app. This was someone he sought every day, someone who attended the same company meetings, someone who had been part of our professional social circle without my knowledge. I scrolled through months of her carefully curated posts. Photos of artisanal cocktails at upscale restaurants, weekend getaways to wine country, designer handbags and jewelry that exceeded a marketing director's salary, unless she had additional income sources. And scattered throughout, like breadcrumbs leading to the truth, were location tags that matched Alexander's business trips perfectly. April 15th, Tabitha posted a sunset photo from the Hotel Carmel, tagged with Weekend Wine Tasting Retreat. Alexander had been in Carmel that same weekend for a site assessment meeting. May 3rd, her Instagram story showed champagne glasses at a Santa Barbara resort, celebrating life's beautiful moments, the caption read. Alexander had been in Santa Barbara evaluating coastal construction challenges. May 22nd, a photo of expensive sushi with the location tagged as Nobu Malibu. Alexander had attended a client dinner in Malibu that evening. The timeline aligned with devastating precision. Every business trip, every client dinner, every work emergency that had separated us corresponded with Tabitha's social media documentation of romantic experiences. They weren't just having an affair. They were living a parallel life together, complete with romantic getaways and anniversary celebrations, while I stayed home maintaining the facade of our marriage. But the most damaging discovery came buried in her older posts. A photo from 8 months ago showing Tabitha's hand wearing what appeared to be a promise ring, with the caption, "When someone sees your worth and wants to build something beautiful together, #new beginnings, #worth the wait." 8 months. Their relationship had been serious enough for promise rings 8 months ago. That meant Alexander had been planning his exit from our marriage while I was still believing we were working through a rough patch. I screenshot every relevant post, building a comprehensive digital timeline that corroborated the financial evidence I'd already gathered. Tabitha had essentially documented Alexander's affair for me, posting their relationship milestones and romantic adventures for anyone careful enough to connect the dots. The most recent post made my blood run cold. 3 days ago, the same day I'd found the Marcello's receipt, Tabitha had posted a photo of her hand wearing a stunning emerald-cut diamond ring. The caption read, "Some dreams are worth waiting for. When you know, you know. #engaged, future wife, happiest day." Engaged? Alexander had proposed to his mistress while still married to me. I stared at my phone screen, feeling physically sick. This wasn't just an affair anymore. This was fraud, bigamy, a complete reconstruction of Alexander's life that left no room for me in his future. While I'd been planning anniversary dinners and considering marriage counseling, Alexander had been planning his engagement to another woman. The engagement ring looked familiar, and it took me several minutes to remember why. the jeweler's receipt I'd found among our credit card statements. $28,000 charged to our joint account for an engagement ring Alexander had given to his mistress. He'd used our money I contributed through my teaching salary and careful budgeting, to purchase an engagement ring for the woman he was leaving me for. The violation was so complete, so calculated, that I had to grip my desk to keep from throwing my phone across the classroom. During my planning period, I dove deeper into Tabitha's social media history, looking for clues about how their relationship had developed. The evidence was all there, hidden in plain sight behind carefully cropped photos and vague captions that avoided directly mentioning Alexander. Their first appearance together was subtle, a photo of 2 wine glasses at a restaurant posted 10 months ago, with the caption, "When networking turns into something special." The beginning of their affair, documented for posterity. Then came regular posts about date nights and weekend adventures with mysterious companions whose faces were always just out of frame. Photos of couples activities, tandem bike rides, wine tastings, sunset dinners, where Alexander's presence was implied but never explicitly shown. 3 months ago, the posts became bolder. Tabitha started including Alexander's hands in photos, then his reflection in wine glasses and mirrors. Anyone who knew Alexander well could identify him from these partial glimpses. She was gradually introducing their relationship to her social media audience, testing the waters for a more public announcement. The engagement post was the culmination of months of careful documentation. Tabitha had chronicled their entire relationship progression, from the initial networking dinner to the proposal 8 months later. She'd created a digital love story that proved Alexander had been planning his exit from our marriage almost from the beginning of their affair. I thought about my colleague Gabrielle's wedding last year, how she documented every milestone of her relationship with Stephen. The social media timeline of their courtship was sweet and romantic, shared with friends and family who celebrated each step toward their engagement. Tabitha had done the same thing, except her love story was built on the destruction of someone else's marriage. Every romantic milestone she'd celebrated represented another lie Alexander had told me, another evening I'd spent alone, another piece of our shared future being systematically dismantled. But her detailed documentation had also provided me with irrefutable evidence of the timeline, scope, and seriousness of Alexander's betrayal. Tabitha's need to document their relationship had created a digital paper trail that would be invaluable when this marriage finally ended in divorce court. As I compiled screenshots and cross-referenced dates with our financial records, I realized that Alexander's deception was even more extensive than I'd initially understood. This wasn't a midlife crisis or a temporary lapse in judgment. This was a calculated reconstruction of his entire life, complete with a new partner, new social circle, and new future that excluded me entirely. The woman sleeping beside me every night had no idea that her husband had already moved on emotionally, financially, and romantically. But now I knew, and knowledge, I was beginning to understand, was the foundation of power. Tomorrow, I would begin planning exactly how to use that power. The hardest part wasn't discovering Alexander's betrayal, it was pretending I didn't know about it. For 2 weeks after finding Tabitha's engagement announcement, I lived in a strange twilight existence, maintaining the facade of our marriage while internally preparing for its destruction. Every morning, I watched Alexander shower and dress for work, knowing he'd see Tabitha within the hour. I'd kiss him goodbye at the door, the same ritual we'd maintained for 8 years, except now I understood I was kissing a stranger. His lips had become foreign territory, contaminated by lies and promises made to another woman. "Have a good day at work," I'd say, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "You too, beautiful," he'd reply, using the same endearment he'd probably whispered to Tabitha during their secret lunch meetings. The Tuesday nights became exercises in psychological endurance. Alexander would announce his departure for another client dinner, and I'd wave goodbye from the kitchen window, watching his car disappear down Maple Street. Then I'd spend the evening knowing exactly where he was, at Marcello's, celebrating another week of their secret relationship while I graded papers and planned lessons for children who trusted me to guide them toward truth and knowledge. The irony wasn't lost on me. I taught my fifth graders about honesty, integrity, and facing difficult truths while living the most elaborate lie of my life every single day. Sleep became impossible. I'd lie beside Alexander, listening to his peaceful breathing, wondering if he dreamed about Tabitha. Did he plan their future while unconsciously sharing a bed with his current wife? Was I just an inconvenient obstacle to be managed until he figured out how to dispose of me permanently? Some nights, I'd study his sleeping face in the dim light filtering through our bedroom curtains, searching for traces of the man I'd fallen in love with. The curve of his jaw was the same, the way his hair fell across his forehead unchanged. But behind his closed eyelids lived thoughts and dreams I could no longer access, emotions and plans that excluded me entirely. The most torturous moments came when Alexander was genuinely kind to me. When he'd bring me coffee in bed on Saturday mornings, when he'd ask about my students with apparent interest, when he'd absent-mindedly rub my shoulders while we watched television together. These gestures of habitual affection felt like cruelty disguised as love. "You seem distracted lately," he observed one evening as we cleaned dishes together. "Everything okay at school?" The question was probably genuine. Part of him still cared about my well-being, still noticed when I seemed upset. But his concern felt hollow when I knew he was planning to abandon me for another woman. How could he ask about my emotional state while systematically destroying the foundation of my emotional security? "Just tired," I replied, focusing on the soap bubbles in the sink rather than meeting his eyes. "End-of-year assessments are always stressful." Alexander nodded sympathetically, then launched into his own work stress, a difficult client, budget constraints, timeline pressures. I listened with the appearance of attention while mentally cataloging the lies embedded in his monologue. The difficult client was probably code for wedding planning complications. The budget constraints might refer to financing a double life. The timeline pressures could be about coordinating his divorce and remarriage schedule. Every conversation became a puzzle to decode, every gesture subject to suspicion and analysis. When Alexander brought home flowers just because, I wondered if he was compensating for guilt or practicing romantic gestures he'd later use with Tabitha. When he suggested we try a new restaurant for date night, I researched the location to ensure it wasn't another venue where he'd previously dined with his mistress. The emotional exhaustion was overwhelming. Maintaining normal behavior while processing the magnitude of Alexander's deception required constant vigilance. I had to remember which lies I was supposed to believe, which stories I'd already heard, which reactions would seem natural versus suspicious. At school, I found myself teaching with unusual intensity about honesty and trust. During a lesson about character development in literature, I asked my students to discuss the importance of truthfulness in relationships. "Why do you think people lie?" I asked 10-year-old Jeremy Mulligan, whose hand had shot up eagerly. "Maybe they're scared of getting in trouble," he replied thoughtfully, "or they don't want to hurt someone's feelings." "Those are understandable reasons," I acknowledged, but what happens when lies become a pattern, when someone lies repeatedly to people who trust them? Anna Sweeney raised her hand. Then the trust gets broken, and once trust is broken, it's really hard to fix. The wisdom of children. Anna had summarized in 2 sentences what I'd been struggling to process for weeks. Trust, once broken through systematic deception, couldn't be repaired through apologies or explanations. Some betrayals were too fundamental to overcome. My students' innocent insights about honesty and betrayal kept me grounded during the most surreal moments of my double life. They reminded me that truth mattered, that integrity wasn't negotiable, that people deserved better than elaborate deceptions from those they loved. But living with secret knowledge was changing me in ways I hadn't anticipated. I'd always been direct and honest, sometimes to a fault. Now I was learning the art of strategic silence, careful observation, and calculated responses. Alexander's betrayal was teaching me skills I'd never wanted to develop. The woman who had once shared every thought and feeling with her husband was becoming someone who hoarded information like a precious resource. I was developing the emotional armor necessary to survive discovery, investigation, and eventual confrontation. 3 weeks into my secret knowledge, Alexander made an announcement that tested my newfound acting abilities to their limits. "I've been thinking," he said over breakfast, buttering his toast with unusual deliberation. "Maybe we should take a vacation this summer, get away from work stress, reconnect as a couple." The suggestion was so audacious, so perfectly calculated to seem loving while serving his agenda, that I nearly laughed out loud. A romantic vacation would provide excellent cover for gradually introducing the concept of separation. He could manufacture conflicts, document our incompatibility, build a case for why our marriage was failing naturally. "That sounds wonderful," I replied, my voice steady despite the rage building in my chest. "Where were you thinking?" "Maybe Europe. We always talked about visiting Italy together." Italy, where he'd probably already planned to honeymoon with Tabitha. "Let me check my school calendar. I want to make sure we have enough time to really enjoy ourselves." Alexander smiled, pleased with my enthusiasm for his manipulative vacation proposal. He had no idea that I was already planning a very different kind of trip, one that would take him far from the comfortable lies he'd been living and straight into the harsh light of public exposure. The secret knowledge was becoming my weapon, and I was learning exactly how to wield it. The overheard phone conversation that changed everything happened on a Wednesday evening in late May. Alexander thought I was at my pottery class, but the instructor had called in sick, leaving me to return home 2 hours earlier than expected. I parked in the driveway and was approaching our front door when I heard Alexander's voice carrying through the open window of his home office. "The timing has to be perfect," he was saying, his tone more serious than I'd heard in months. "Carol can't suspect anything until after the papers are served." I froze on our front porch, my pottery bag slipping from my shoulder. Papers. Legal papers. Moving carefully to avoid the creaky boards near the window, I positioned myself where I could hear clearly without being seen. Alexander was pacing in his office, phone pressed to his ear, completely absorbed in what sounded like strategic planning.
I know it seems cruel, Karen, but this protects everyone involved, Alexander continued. If Carol finds out about Tabitha before the divorce is finalized, she could make things complicated. Her lawyer could argue for more alimony, claim emotional damages. His divorce attorney was named Karen Sweeney. I'd seen her business card fall from his wallet weeks ago and assumed it was a networking contact. Now I understood why a family law specialist's card was in my husband's possession. "The restaurant plan will work perfectly," Alexander said, and I could hear the satisfaction in his voice. "Carol's been suspicious about my Tuesday dinners lately, asking more questions, so I'll invite her to Marcello's this Thursday, make it seem like a romantic gesture. She'll think I'm recommending our new favorite restaurant." My blood turned to ice water. Thursday was tomorrow. Alexander was planning to take me to Marcello's, the site of his romantic dinners with Tabitha, as part of some elaborate scheme? "Tabitha will be there with her friend Anna at a nearby table," Alexander continued. "It'll look like a coincidence when I introduce them. Carol's always been paranoid about my work relationships, so her reaction will seem unreasonable. We'll have witnesses to her jealous behavior." The cruelty of the plan took my breath away. Alexander wasn't just planning to divorce me, he was orchestrating a public humiliation designed to make me look unstable and unreasonable. He wanted witnesses to testify that I was jealous, paranoid, impossible to live with. "Tabitha knows what to do," Alexander said, and I could hear him settling into his desk chair. "She'll be friendly but professional, just a colleague enjoying dinner with a friend. When Carol reacts badly, and she will because she's been increasingly paranoid lately, everyone will see her true nature." Paranoid. He was calling me paranoid for suspecting the affair that was actually happening? The gaslighting was so complete, so systematic, that I had to grip the porch railing to steady myself.
After that scene, filing for divorce will be easy to justify, Alexander continued. I'll have documented evidence of her erratic behavior, her baseless accusations, her inability to handle normal social situations. The judge will see that our marriage failed because of her issues, not because of anything I did. Normal social situations. Meeting your husband's mistress and her friend at the restaurant where they'd been conducting their affair for months was anything but normal. But Alexander was reframing reality to serve his narrative. The house will be the tricky part, he said, and I heard papers rustling. It's in both our names, but I've been making the mortgage payments from my business account for the past year. My lawyer thinks we can argue that it's primarily my asset, since Carol's teacher salary doesn't really contribute to the household finances. The dismissal of my financial contributions stung almost as much as the affair itself. I'd contributed every penny of my teaching salary to our joint accounts, had lived frugally to help save for our shared goals. Now Alexander was planning to argue that my modest income made me an insignificant partner in our marriage. Tabitha's already looking at condos for us, Alexander said, his voice warming with affection. Something in Manhattan Beach, close to the water. She found a beautiful 2-bedroom with ocean views. We could move in as soon as the divorce is final. Ocean views, purchased with money from our joint accounts, in a condo I'd helped finance through 8 years of shared resources? The betrayal was so complete, so calculated, that I felt physically nauseated. The timeline works perfectly, Alexander continued. We serve Carol the papers next month, right before summer break. She'll have the whole summer to find a new place and adjust to being on her own. By the time school starts in the fall, this will all be settled. I know Tabitha's anxious to make it official, he said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. She's been incredible through all of this. Patient, understanding, supportive. She deserves better than having to hide our relationship. Tabitha deserved better than hiding their relationship built on the destruction of someone else's marriage. But I apparently deserved nothing. Not honesty, not respect, not even the dignity of learning about my husband's plans before his lawyer did. Carol will probably try to fight the settlement, Alexander said, his tone becoming businesslike again. She's stubborn when she doesn't get her way. But with documented evidence of her jealous outbursts and unreasonable behavior, her lawyer will advise her to accept our terms. Unreasonable behavior? Like expecting fidelity from your spouse? Like trusting that shared financial accounts weren't being used to finance affairs? Like believing that marriage vows meant something? The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, covering practical details of asset division, custody arrangements for the dog we'd adopted together, and timeline logistics for Alexander's new life with Tabitha. Every detail had been planned with military precision, from the public humiliation at Marcello's to the condo purchase to the summer timing that would minimize disruption to Alexander's career. I'd been living with a stranger who'd been methodically planning the destruction of our marriage while I graded papers and planned lessons and maintained the household routines that kept our life functioning. Every kind gesture, every moment of apparent normalcy had been performance art designed to keep me docile until he was ready to execute his exit strategy. When the call finally ended, I remained frozen on the porch, processing the magnitude of what I'd overheard. Alexander wasn't just having an affair. He was conducting a sophisticated campaign of psychological manipulation designed to gaslight me into accepting blame for our marriage's failure. The restaurant dinner tomorrow wasn't a romantic gesture. It was a trap designed to make me look unstable in front of witnesses who would later testify about my jealous and paranoid behavior when I met his mistress. But Alexander had made one crucial miscalculation. He'd planned his strategy assuming I was still the trusting, naive wife who accepted his explanations without question. He had no idea that I'd been conducting my own investigation, gathering evidence, and documenting his deception for weeks. His plan to humiliate me at Marcello's would backfire spectacularly because I'd be walking into that restaurant with full knowledge of who Tabitha was and what they'd been doing there every Tuesday night. Instead of reacting with shocked jealousy, I'd be prepared to expose the truth about their affair in front of the very witnesses Alexander planned to use against me. Quietly, I retrieved my pottery bag and slipped back to my car. I'd wait 20 minutes, then return home with a story about the canceled class. Alexander would never know I'd overheard his strategy session with his divorce attorney. But tomorrow night at Marcello's, he'd discover that his carefully planned ambush had become his own exposure. The prey he thought he was hunting had become the predator, and the trap he'd set was about to close around him instead of me. As I sat in my car, hands shaking with rage and adrenaline, I realized that Alexander's betrayal had transformed me into someone I'd never imagined becoming. The trusting wife was gone, replaced by someone capable of strategic thinking and calculated revenge. Tomorrow night would be the performance of my life, and Alexander had no idea he'd written the script for his own downfall. That night, while Alexander slept peacefully beside me, I lay awake formulating my response to his elaborate trap. He'd planned every detail of tomorrow's restaurant ambush except for one crucial variable. My reaction wouldn't be the jealous outburst he was counting on. I spent the dark hours before dawn mentally rehearsing different scenarios. Alexander expected me to react with shock and suspicion when I met Tabitha. Instead, I would be gracious, friendly, and completely unruffled. When he introduced his colleague, I'd shake her hand warmly and express genuine pleasure at finally meeting someone I'd heard so much about. The irony was perfect. Alexander's plan depended on me appearing paranoid and jealous. My calm, rational behavior would undermine his entire narrative about my unstable personality and unreasonable suspicions. The witnesses he'd arranged to document my poor behavior would instead see a composed wife making polite conversation with her husband's coworker. By 6 a.m., I had my counter-strategy fully formed. I would need 3 things: documentation, witnesses of my own, and perfect timing. Alexander had taught me that preparation was everything, and I intended to be more prepared than he could possibly imagine. My first call was to my friend Gabrielle Sweeney at 7:30 a.m., catching her before she left for school. "I need a favor," I said without preamble. "Are you free for dinner tomorrow night? Somewhere nice, my treat." "Of course," Gabrielle replied, though I could hear the curiosity in her voice. "What's the occasion?" "Alexander is taking me to this restaurant he's been talking about, and I thought it would be fun to have friends there too. You know how he gets nervous in purely social situations." The lie came easily. Alexander had never been nervous in social situations, but Gabrielle didn't need to know that. What she needed to know was that I wanted witnesses to whatever was about to unfold at Marcello's. "Should I bring Stephen?" she asked. "Absolutely. Make it a double date. I'll text you the details." My second call was to my sister-in-law, Bethany Thatcher, Alexander's younger sister, who worked as a freelance photographer. Bethany had always been fond of me, sometimes taking my side in family disputes when Alexander became too focused on business. "Bethany, I have an unusual request," I began. "Would you be interested in photographing a restaurant dinner tomorrow night? I want to surprise Alexander with professional photos of a special evening." "That's so sweet," Bethany replied. "Of course I'll help. Which restaurant?" "Marcello's downtown, the one with the beautiful lighting. I think the ambiance would make for gorgeous photos." Bethany agreed enthusiastically, pleased to be included in what she believed was a romantic gesture. She had no idea she'd be documenting the end of her brother's marriage instead of celebrating it. With my witnesses arranged, I turned to documentation. Alexander's credit card statements and Tabitha's social media posts were compelling evidence, but I needed something more immediate, more dramatic. I needed proof that could be presented in real time during tomorrow's dinner. The solution came to me while preparing breakfast. Alexander always carried his phone everywhere, but he charged it on his nightstand while sleeping. If I could access his text messages with Tabitha, I'd have real-time evidence of their affair planning. During his morning shower, I carefully lifted Alexander's phone from the charger. His passcode was easy, our wedding anniversary, because he'd never bothered changing it despite his evolving priorities. The arrogance of using our wedding date to protect communications with his mistress was almost poetic. The text thread with Tabitha was extensive and damning. Months of romantic messages, logistical planning for their secret dinners, and excited discussions about their future together. But most valuable were the recent messages about tomorrow's dinner. "Everything's set for tomorrow?" Alexander had texted Tuesday evening. "Anna's confirmed for 8 p.m. Table 12, just like we discussed. I'll wear the blue dress you like." Perfect. Carol still thinks it's just a romantic dinner for two. She has no idea what's coming. "I almost feel bad for her," Tabitha had responded, "but this is necessary for our future." "She'll be fine. Teachers are resilient. Besides, she's been increasingly difficult lately. This will actually be a relief for everyone." I screenshot every relevant message, creating a comprehensive record of their conspiracy to manipulate tomorrow's dinner. Alexander's own words would prove that the encounter was planned, that Tabitha's presence wasn't coincidental, and that they'd orchestrated the entire evening to make me appear unstable. But I needed one more element to make my counter-strategy complete, the perfect moment to reveal what I knew. Alexander expected me to react immediately upon meeting Tabitha, providing instant drama for his witnesses to observe. Instead, I would wait, allowing the evening to unfold exactly as he'd planned, until the moment when maximum damage could be inflicted on his narrative. During my lunch break, I visited Marcello's to scout the layout and speak with the manager. The restaurant was elegant but intimate, with soft lighting and closely spaced tables that would ensure any conversation could be overheard by neighboring diners. "I'd like to make a reservation for tomorrow evening," I told the hostess. "Table 11, if it's available." Table 11 was directly adjacent to Table 12, where Alexander and I would be dining, according to his plan. Having Gabrielle and Stephen seated there would ensure I had supportive witnesses within arm's reach when the evening reached its climax. "Table 11 for 4 at 8 p.m. Any special occasion?" "You could say that," I replied. "It's going to be a very memorable evening." By Thursday afternoon, every piece of my counter-strategy was in place. Gabrielle and Stephen would arrive at Marcello's at 7:45, giving them time to settle at Table 11 before Alexander and I appeared. Bethany would position herself discreetly near the bar, ready to photograph whatever unfolded. I had comprehensive documentation of Alexander's affair and his manipulation plan saved to multiple devices. Most importantly, I had transformed from victim to strategist. The woman Alexander planned to ambush no longer existed. In her place was someone who understood that information was power, that patience was a weapon, and that the element of surprise could be turned against those who wielded it carelessly. Alexander thought he was leading me into a trap. Instead, he was walking into an exposure that would destroy the carefully constructed narrative he'd planned to use in divorce proceedings. Tomorrow night at Marcello's, the hunter would become the hunted, and I would finally have justice for 8 months of systematic deception. The performance was about to begin, and I was ready for my starring role. Thursday evening arrived with the kind of perfect spring weather that made deception seem impossible. As I dressed for dinner, selecting a navy blue dress that projected confidence without appearing confrontational, Alexander hummed cheerfully in our bathroom, completely unaware that his elaborate scheme was about to backfire spectacularly. "You look beautiful," he said, adjusting his tie in the mirror, the same charcoal gray tie he'd worn to several of his Tuesday dinners with Tabitha. "I'm excited to finally take you to Marcello's. I think you'll love it." The casual lie rolled off his tongue with practiced ease. Alexander spoke as if he'd never been to Marcello's before, as if this were a spontaneous romantic gesture rather than a calculated trap designed to humiliate me in front of carefully arranged witnesses. "I'm looking forward to it," I replied, meeting his eyes in the mirror. "It's been too long since we had a proper date night." We arrived at Marcello's at exactly 8 p.m., and I felt a surge of satisfaction when I spotted Gabrielle and Stephen already seated at Table 11, studying their menus with apparent casualness. Bethany was positioned at the bar, camera discreetly positioned to capture whatever unfolded. The hostess led us to Table 12, the same intimate corner booth where Alexander and Tabitha had celebrated their anniversary just weeks ago. As we settled into the burgundy leather seats, I noticed Alexander scanning the restaurant with barely concealed anticipation. The wine list here is supposed to be excellent, he said, though his attention was clearly focused on something other than beverages. Really? How did you hear about this place? I asked innocently, opening my menu. Colleague recommendation, Alexander replied, his standard answer for anything connected to his secret life. Someone at the firm mentioned it. At 8:15, right on schedule, Tabitha Hackett made her entrance. She wore a stunning blue dress, the same blue dress she'd mentioned in her text messages to Alexander, and moved through the restaurant with the confidence of someone playing a predetermined role. Her companion, a blonde woman I assumed was Anna, followed slightly behind. They were seated at table 14, positioned perfectly within Alexander's line of sight, but far enough away to seem coincidental. Tabitha caught Alexander's eye almost immediately, offering a surprised smile and subtle wave that suggested unexpected but pleasant recognition. "Oh, there's someone from work," Alexander said, his tone carefully modulated to sound casual. "Would you mind if I went over to say hello? It would be rude to ignore her." "Of course," I replied graciously. "I'd love to meet your colleagues." Alexander's moment of hesitation was barely perceptible, but I caught it. He'd expected me to decline, to show some sign of territorial behavior that would support his narrative about my jealous tendencies. My immediate agreement disrupted his script. "Well, if you're sure," he said, recovering quickly, "I'll just introduce you briefly." We approached table 14, and I watched Tabitha's face carefully as we drew near. She was a beautiful woman, auburn hair, intelligent green eyes, expensive jewelry that exceeded a marketing director's typical budget. But beneath her polished exterior, I detected nervousness that suggested she wasn't as comfortable with this deception as Alexander believed. "Tabitha, what a pleasant surprise," Alexander said, his performance flawless. "I'd like you to meet my wife, Carol. Carol, this is Tabitha Hackett from our marketing department." "It's wonderful to finally meet you," I said warmly, extending my hand with genuine seeming enthusiasm. Alexander's handshake was firm, but I felt her fingers tremble slightly. "The pleasure is mine," she replied. "Alexander speaks about you constantly. You're a teacher, aren't you?" "Fifth grade at Riverside Elementary," I confirmed. "And this must be Anna." Anna Dubbs nodded politely, clearly uncomfortable with her role in whatever drama was supposed to unfold. She kept glancing between Alexander and Tabitha as if waiting for cues about how to proceed. "We were just discussing the new hotel project," Tabitha said, attempting to establish a business context for their dinner. "Anna's helping with the marketing strategy." "How interesting," I replied. "Alexander loves hotel projects. He always comes home so energized after working on hospitality designs." Alexander's smile faltered almost imperceptibly. He'd never worked on hotel designs during our marriage. His firm focused on commercial office buildings and retail developments. But Tabitha wouldn't know that detail about his professional background. "Well, we should let you get back to your dinner," Alexander said, clearly eager to return to our table before the conversation could develop in problematic directions. "Actually," I said, maintaining my bright smile, "why don't you join us? I'd love to hear more about this hotel project. We have plenty of room at our table." The invitation landed like a bomb in the middle of their carefully orchestrated plan. Alexander had expected me to react with suspicion or jealousy, providing clear evidence of my unreasonable behavior. Instead, I was being gracious and inclusive, extending hospitality to his mistress and her friend. "Oh, we couldn't impose," Tabitha said quickly, her composure beginning to crack. "You're having a romantic dinner." "Nonsense," I insisted. "Alexander's always telling me how important networking is in architecture. This would give me a chance to understand his work better." I could see the panic building in Alexander's eyes. The restaurant was full of potential witnesses, including his own sister positioned at the bar with her camera. If Tabitha joined our table, any intimate conversation or familiar gesture between them would be impossible to explain away as professional collegiality. "Carol's right," Alexander said, trapped by his own manipulation. "You should join us, unless you had other plans." Tabitha looked to Anna for support, but Anna seemed equally uncertain about how to proceed. They'd been prepared for my jealous outburst, not my gracious invitation, to extend our romantic dinner into a professional networking opportunity. I suppose we could join you for a drink, Tabitha said finally, her voice strained with the effort of maintaining her performance. As we returned to our table, now expanded to accommodate 4 people instead of the intimate dinner for 2 Alexander had planned, I felt a surge of satisfaction. His carefully constructed trap was becoming his own prison, and the evening was just beginning. The hunter had become the hunted, and my prey had no idea how thoroughly they've been outmaneuvered. As the waiter rearranged our table, now expanded to accommodate 4 people instead of the intimate dinner for 2 Alexander had planned, I felt a surge of satisfaction. His carefully constructed trap was becoming his own prison, and the evening was just beginning. The hunter had become the hunted, and my prey had no idea how thoroughly they'd been outmaneuvered. As the waiter rearranged our table to accommodate 4 people instead of the intimate dinner for 2 Alexander had planned, I watched the subtle interplay between Alexander and Tabitha with fascination. They were trying so hard to appear like casual colleagues that their forced formality became suspicious to anyone paying attention. The easy intimacy I'd witnessed through surveillance was replaced by stilted conversation and careful body language. "So, tell me about this hotel project," I said, settling into my seat with genuine seeming interest. Tabitha glanced nervously at Alexander before answering. "It's still in early development stages, market research, demographic analysis, that sort of thing." "Where will it be located?" I pressed, maintaining my bright smile while mentally cataloging every inconsistency in their improvised story. "Downtown," Alexander said vaguely. "We're still evaluating several sites." I nodded enthusiastically. "That's exciting. I love how you get to shape the city's landscape through your work. How long have you two been collaborating on projects?" The innocent question landed with perfect precision. Alexander and Tabitha exchanged a look that lasted a fraction too long, the kind of glance that passed between lovers, not colleagues discussing business timelines. 8 months, Tabitha replied, and I noticed her hand unconsciously move toward the engagement ring she'd hidden in her purse for tonight's performance. 8 months, I repeated thoughtfully. That's quite a substantial working relationship. You must know each other pretty well by now. Anna shifted uncomfortably in her seat, clearly sensing undercurrents she didn't fully understand. She'd been recruited as a prop in Alexander's drama, but the script was deviating from whatever she'd been told to expect. "Tabitha's been invaluable to several projects," Alexander said, his voice carrying just a hint of the warmth he usually reserved for discussing her with his divorce attorney. "I'm sure she has," I replied, then turned to address Tabitha directly. "Alexander's always been passionate about his work. Sometimes I joke that he's married to his job. Do you find the same thing? That architecture becomes all-consuming?" Tabitha's composure was beginning to fracture under the weight of maintaining her deception. "It can be demanding," she said carefully, "but working with someone who shares your vision makes it rewarding." "Someone who shares your vision," I repeated, savoring the phrase. "That's beautifully put. Vision is so important in any partnership, isn't it? Whether professional or personal." Alexander was beginning to recognize that something was wrong with his carefully orchestrated evening. I could see him processing my behavior, comparing my gracious responses to the jealous outburst he'd planned to provoke. His growing confusion was almost as satisfying as Tabitha's obvious discomfort. The waiter appeared to take our expanded order, and I seized the opportunity to escalate the evening's tension. "You know what?" I said suddenly, as if struck by inspiration. "We should get a bottle of champagne to celebrate this project collaboration. What do you think, Alexander? Isn't this exactly the kind of professional relationship worth toasting?" Alexander's face went pale. Champagne celebrations were significant in his relationship with Tabitha. I'd seen the evidence in credit card charges and social media posts. The suggestion carried implications that made him visibly uncomfortable. "Maybe just wine," he said quickly. "We don't want to make this too much of a celebration." "Nonsense," I insisted, signaling the waiter. "Success should be celebrated properly. Tabitha, what do you think? Champagne seems appropriate for marking 8 months of productive collaboration, doesn't it?" Tabitha's smile looked increasingly strained. "Wine would be fine," she said weakly. "I insist on champagne," I said firmly, then turned to the waiter. "Your best vintage, please. We're celebrating a very special partnership." As the waiter departed, I reached into my purse and withdrew my phone with deliberate casualness. Actually, before the champagne arrives, I have something interesting to share. Alexander, remember that photography project I mentioned? The one about documenting important moments in relationships? Alexander's confusion deepened. "What photography project?" "Oh, you know," I said, unlocking my phone and scrolling to the screenshot folder I'd prepared. "I've been documenting some fascinating relationship dynamics lately. Look at this, for instance." I turned my phone screen toward the table, displaying the first screenshot of Alexander and Tabitha's text conversation. The message about planning tomorrow's dinner was clearly visible, along with their discussion about making me appear unstable in front of witnesses. The effect was immediate and devastating. Tabitha gasped audibly, her hand flying to her mouth. Alexander's face cycled through confusion, recognition, and horror in rapid succession. Anna looked between the phone screen and the people around the table, trying to understand what she was seeing. "This is particularly interesting," I continued, swiping to the next screenshot. "The planning that goes into orchestrating these chance encounters is really quite sophisticated." "Carol," Alexander said, his voice barely above a whisper, "what are you doing?" "I'm sharing my photography project," I replied pleasantly. "You know how much I love documenting authentic moments. This whole conversation thread is fascinating from an anthropological perspective. The elaborate planning, the careful staging, the attention to witness placement." I looked around the table with bright interest, as if conducting an academic discussion rather than exposing a systematic deception. It's amazing how people think they can control narratives by controlling information, but documentation has a way of revealing truth, doesn't it? Tabitha was staring at the phone screen with the expression of someone watching their world collapse in real time. The text messages laid bare not just their affair, but their conspiracy to manipulate me into appearing unstable during divorce proceedings. "The really clever part," I continued, scrolling through more screenshots, "is how you plan to use tonight's dinner as evidence of my jealous and paranoid behavior. Except I'm not feeling jealous or paranoid at all. I'm feeling quite empowered, actually." Alexander reached across the table, trying to grab my phone, but I pulled it back smoothly. "Careful," I said, my voice still friendly but carrying a steel edge. "We wouldn't want to create a scene in front of all these witnesses. That might send the wrong message about who's really unstable in this relationship." The champagne arrived at that moment, the waiter oblivious to the tension crackling around our table. He poured 4 glasses with professional efficiency, while my husband's affair partner struggled not to hyperventilate, and my husband himself sat frozen in obvious shock. "To partnerships," I said, raising my glass in a toast, "to the power of documentation, and to the fascinating ways that truth has of revealing itself, even when people work very hard to hide it." Neither Alexander nor Tabitha reached for their glasses. Anna lifted hers uncertainly, still trying to understand her role in whatever drama was unfolding. The trap Alexander had set for me had become his own exposure, and the evening was far from over. The silence that followed my toast stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Around us, the normal dinner conversation of other patrons continued, creating a surreal backdrop to the implosion happening at our table. The clink of silverware and distant laughter seemed to come from another world entirely. Alexander was the first to break. "Carol, we need to talk about this privately," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "Not here." "But I love talking here," I replied, taking a sip of champagne and savoring both the vintage and the moment. "Marcello's has such wonderful ambiance for important conversations. You've certainly seemed to enjoy discussing significant matters here before." Tabitha made a choking sound that might have been an attempt at speech. Her face had gone from pale to greenish, and she kept glancing toward the exit as if calculating escape routes. "This is insane," Alexander said, his composure finally cracking. You've been spying on me? Going through my phone? Spying is such an ugly word, I said thoughtfully. I prefer gathering documentation. You know, the way attorneys do when they're building cases. Speaking of which, how is Karen Sweeney? Your divorce lawyer seemed very thorough during that phone conversation I accidentally overheard. The mention of his attorney's name hit Alexander like a physical blow. He'd been hoping this was just about the affair, that somehow I hadn't uncovered the full scope of his manipulation. The realization that I knew about his legal strategy and planned timeline visibly devastated him. "You've been eavesdropping on privileged attorney-client communications," he said desperately, grasping for some moral high ground. "That's illegal." "Standing on my own front porch isn't illegal," I corrected pleasantly. "And neither is documenting financial fraud, using our joint credit card to finance affairs and engagement rings. Though I'm sure Karen could explain the legal implications better than I can." Anna finally found her voice. "I think I should leave," she said, starting to rise from her chair. "Please don't," I said, gesturing for her to sit back down. "You're an important witness to this evening's events. Alexander specifically arranged for witnesses, and I'd hate for his planning to go to waste." Across the restaurant, I caught sight of Bethany at the bar, camera discreetly positioned to capture the drama unfolding at our table. At table 11, Gabriel and Stephen were making a valiant effort to appear absorbed in their own dinner while clearly listening to every word of our conversation. "Tabitha," I continued, turning my attention to Alexander's mistress, "I have to ask about that engagement ring you posted on Instagram. The emerald-cut diamond was stunning. How does it feel knowing your fiancé used his wife's money to purchase it?" Tabitha's composure finally shattered completely. "I didn't know," she whispered, tears beginning to stream down her perfectly made-up face. "Alexander told me you two were already separated. He said the divorce was just a formality." "Separated?" I laughed, a sound with no humor in it. "We've been living in the same house, sharing the same bed, attending family events together. What exactly did that separation look like to you?" "He said you were staying together for financial reasons," Tabitha said desperately, "that you both agreed the marriage was over, but needed time to arrange the practical details." I turned to Alexander with mock curiosity. "Is that what you told her? How interesting, because from my perspective, we've been living as husband and wife right up until this moment. In fact, just this morning, you suggested we take a romantic vacation to Italy this summer." Alexander's face cycled through several expressions as he realized how thoroughly his lies were unraveling. The story he'd told Tabitha about our marriage being effectively over couldn't coexist with the evidence of our continued domestic life together. "The vacation was part of the transition plan," he said weakly, but even he seemed to recognize how ridiculous that sounded. "A transition plan that involved using our joint savings to finance your relationship with another woman?" I clarified, "while lying to both of us about the nature of your commitments." I pulled up another screenshot on my phone, this one showing Alexander's text to Tabitha about how their engagement would be worth the wait once he handled the Carol situation. The phrase "handled the Carol situation" was particularly damning. It reduced me to a logistical problem to be solved, rather than a person deserving honesty and respect. "You've been systematically defrauding our marriage while planning an elaborate psychological manipulation to make me appear unstable during divorce proceedings," I continued, my voice remaining conversational despite the devastating content. "The only thing more impressive than the scoop of your deception is how completely you underestimated my ability to uncover it." Other diners were beginning to notice our table's tension. I could see heads turning, conversations pausing as people picked up on the drama unfolding nearby. Alexander's plan to create a public scene was succeeding, just not in the way he'd intended. "Carol, please," Alexander said, reaching across the table toward me. "We can work this out. We can go to counseling, figure out how to fix things." "Fix things?" I repeated, genuinely amazed by his audacity. "You want to fix the marriage you've been systematically destroying for 8 months while planning to divorce me and move in with your pregnant mistress?" The word pregnant hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. I'd been saving that particular revelation, gleaned from Tabitha's most recent doctor's appointment charges on Alexander's credit card, for maximum impact. Tabitha's gasp confirmed what I'd suspected. She was pregnant, and from Alexander's expression of shock, it wasn't something they'd discussed openly yet. The restaurant suddenly felt much smaller, the walls closing in on a conspiracy that had just become infinitely more complicated. Alexander's trap had become his complete exposure, and there was nowhere left for any of them to hide. The pregnancy revelation shattered what remained of Alexander's composure. He stared at Tabitha with an expression of complete bewilderment, as if seeing her for the first time. The carefully planned evening had devolved into chaos that none of them could control. "Pregnant?" he repeated, his voice barely audible above the restaurant's ambient noise. Tabitha nodded miserably, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. "I was going to tell you after tonight, after we dealt with this situation." "Dealt with the Carol situation," I corrected, consulting my phone for the exact phrasing from their text messages. "That's how you referred to ending my marriage. A situation to be dealt with." The weight of their deception was finally becoming clear to everyone at the table. Alexander hadn't just been having an affair, he'd been constructing an entirely new life while systematically dismantling his current one. The pregnancy meant their relationship had consequences that extended far beyond divorce proceedings and property settlements. "I need some air," Anna said, standing abruptly and walking toward the exit. She'd clearly had enough of being an unwitting participant in what had become a public implosion. Alexander made one final attempt to regain control of the narrative. "Carol, I know this looks bad, but there are things you don't understand about our marriage. We've been growing apart for years." "Growing apart?" I repeated thoughtfully. "Is that what you call lying about business trips while using our joint savings to finance romantic getaways with your pregnant mistress?" The word mistress hit Tabitha like a physical blow. She'd probably never thought of herself in those terms, had likely constructed a narrative where she was Alexander's true love, helping him escape an unhappy marriage. The reality of her position, other woman, homewrecker, pregnant mistress, was clearly devastating to her self-image. "I should go," Tabitha whispered, fumbling for her purse with shaking hands. "Actually," I said pleasantly, "I think you should stay. We need to discuss some practical matters." I pulled up the photos I'd taken of their credit card statements, displaying the financial evidence of Alexander's systematic fraud. "Tabitha, you should know that Alexander used our joint accounts to finance your entire relationship. The dinners, the weekend trips, the jewelry, even your engagement ring, all purchased with money I contributed through my teaching salary." Tabitha's face went white as she processed the implications. She'd thought she was being courted by a successful architect using his own resources. Instead, she'd been unknowingly participating in the theft of another woman's financial contributions to her marriage. "That makes you an accessory to financial fraud," I continued conversationally, though I'm sure my attorney will explain the legal implications more thoroughly than I can. Alexander finally found his voice. "You can't prove I intended to defraud you. Those were legitimate business expenses." "Business expenses?" I laughed, pulling up Tabitha's Instagram posts on my phone. "Tabitha documented most of your romantic getaways herself. Her social media account provides a comprehensive timeline of how our joint assets were used to finance your affair." I turned the phone toward them, showing the sunset photos from expensive hotels, the champagne celebrations at luxury restaurants, the jewelry pictures with romantic captions. Tabitha had essentially created a digital evidence trail of Alexander's financial crimes against our marriage. Between the credit card statements, the text messages planning tonight's manipulation, and Tabitha's social media documentation, I have evidence to ensure you receive absolutely nothing in our divorce settlement, I said to Alexander. In fact, given the scope of your financial deception, you might end up owing me money. The practical implications were finally sinking in for both of them. Alexander faced losing everything: his house, his savings, his reputation, and his career. Tabitha faced potential legal consequences for her role in financial fraud. plus the reality of being pregnant with a child whose father was about to be financially ruined. "What do you want?" Alexander asked, finally, his voice defeated. "I want you to pack your belongings and move out of our house by this weekend," I said firmly. "I want you to close all joint accounts immediately and transfer my portion to accounts in my name only. And I want you to sign a settlement agreement that gives me the house, the car, and appropriate compensation for the money you stole from our marriage. And if I refuse, then I'll file criminal charges for financial fraud, sue you for every penny you've stolen, and ensure that everyone in your professional network understands exactly why our marriage ended," I replied calmly. "Your choice." Alexander looked around the restaurant desperately, as if seeking escape from the consequences of his actions. The other diners were now openly staring at our table, drawn by the increasingly dramatic conversation. His plan to humiliate me had resulted in his own public exposure. "Fine," he said finally. "I'll sign whatever you want." "Wise decision," I said, raising my champagne glass in a final toast. "To new beginnings, honest relationships, and the power of women who refuse to be underestimated." I drained my glass and stood gracefully, gathering my purse and leaving enough cash on the table to cover our portion of the evening's charges. "Tabitha, you might want to consider whether building a relationship on the destruction of someone else's marriage is really the foundation you want for raising a child." As I walked toward the exit, I caught Bethany's eye at the bar and nodded slightly. She'd captured everything with her camera, creating documentation that would be invaluable in divorce proceedings. At table 11, Gabrielle and Stephen raised their glasses in a subtle salute as I passed. The cool evening air felt like freedom as I stepped outside Marcello's. Behind me, the restaurant contained the wreckage of Alexander's elaborate deception and the beginning of consequences he'd never anticipated. 6 months later, I was living in my own house, teaching my beloved fifth graders, and building a life based on truth rather than manipulation. Alexander and Tabitha were dealing with their own consequences, financial, legal, and personal. Sometimes, the best revenge is simply refusing to be the victim someone expects you to be. Sometimes, justice comes from careful documentation and strategic patience rather than emotional outbursts and dramatic confrontations. And sometimes, the woman everyone underestimates turns out to be the most dangerous person in the room. 1 year after that pivotal dinner at Marcello's, I stood in the kitchen of my new craftsman bungalow, preparing lesson plans for the upcoming school year. The morning light streamed through windows I'd chosen myself, in a home I'd purchased with the settlement money from my divorce settlement. Every corner of this space reflected my choices, my taste, my vision for the future. The house wasn't large or luxurious, but it was authentically mine in ways our Maple Street home had never been. I'd painted the walls in colors that made me happy: sage green in the living room, warm yellow in the kitchen, deep blue in my bedroom. The bookshelves were filled with novels I'd actually read, teaching resources I'd personally selected, and photographs of students whose lives I'd genuinely impacted. My rescue dog Bronte, a golden retriever mix with soulful eyes and boundless energy, padded into the kitchen and settled at my feet. She'd been my constant companion through the divorce proceedings and the adjustment to single life. Unlike humans, dogs were incapable of deception. Their love was straightforward, honest, and dependable. The divorce had been finalized 6 months after the Marcello's confrontation. Alexander's financial fraud had been so thoroughly documented that his attorney advised him to accept my terms rather than face criminal charges. The house, the savings accounts, and substantial alimony payments had given me financial security I'd never experienced during our marriage. Tabitha had given birth to a daughter 3 months ago. I'd seen the announcement on social media, a carefully curated photo that attempted to project happiness despite the circumstances surrounding her child's conception. Alexander was listed as the father, but their relationship status remained conspicuously undefined. Building a family on the foundation of betrayal and manipulation, it seemed, was proving more challenging than they'd anticipated. My phone buzzed with a text from Gabrielle. "Coffee this afternoon? Stephen's making his famous apple turnovers." Gabrielle and Stephen had become even closer friends after witnessing my restaurant revelation. They'd provided unwavering support during the divorce proceedings, offering both practical help and emotional encouragement. Their marriage, built on genuine respect and honest communication, had become a model for the kind of relationship I might want someday in the future. Absolutely, I texted back. I'll bring the good coffee beans. The doorbell rang, and I opened it to find my sister-in-law Bethany standing on the porch with a large portfolio case. Our relationship had actually strengthened after Alexander's exposure. She'd been disgusted by her brother's behavior and had testified on my behalf during the divorce proceedings. "Delivery from the printer," she said, hefting the case. "Your photography exhibition prints are ready." The photography exhibition had been an unexpected development. The images Bethany had captured at Marcello's, the moment of revelation, the expressions of shock and realization, the complete reversal of power dynamics, had evolved into an art project about truth, deception, and women's resilience. We'd titled the exhibition Documented, a study in strategic patience. It would open next month at the Downtown Gallery, with proceeds benefiting a scholarship fund for teachers pursuing advanced degrees. The photographs that had once been evidence in divorce proceedings had become art that celebrated women's capacity for strategic thinking and self-advocacy. "These are incredible," I said, carefully examining the prints. Bethany had captured not just the dramatic confrontation, but the subtle transformation in my posture and expression throughout the evening. The early photos showed a woman playing a role. The later ones revealed someone who had found her authentic power. "You look different in these pictures," Bethany observed. "Stronger, more yourself." She was right. The woman in those photographs was someone I barely recognized, not because she was a stranger, but because she was more genuinely me than I'd been in years. The experience of uncovering Alexander's deception and responding strategically rather than emotionally had revealed capabilities I'd never known I possessed. My teaching had improved dramatically since the divorce. Without the emotional drain of maintaining a fraudulent marriage, I had more energy and creativity to invest in my students. My fifth graders were thriving under the guidance of someone who'd learned firsthand about the power of careful observation, strategic planning, and refusing to accept comfortable lies. "Mrs. Thatcher," 10-year-old Jeremy Mulligan had said last week, "you always know when we're not telling the truth. How do you do that?" "Practice," I'd replied with a smile, and understanding that truth-telling is a skill worth developing. The irony of keeping my married name hadn't been lost on me. Carol Thatcher was the woman who discovered her husband's betrayal and responded with calculated precision. Carol Dubbs, my maiden name, belonged to someone who might have accepted his explanations and continued living a lie. I'd earned the right to keep the name that represented my transformation. As Bethany and I arranged the photographs, I reflected on the lessons of the past year. Alexander's betrayal had been devastating, but it had also been educational. I'd learned to trust my instincts, to value evidence over explanations, and to understand that knowledge truly was power when wielded strategically. The most important lesson had been about self-worth. I'd spent years accepting gradual erosion of respect and affection because I'd been afraid of losing what I thought was love. Now I understood that authentic love didn't require accepting lies, dismissals, or systematic deception. The right person would value my intelligence, integrity, and strength rather than seeing them as obstacles to overcome. "Are you ready for this?" Bethany asked, gesturing to the exhibition prints. "I'm ready for whatever comes next," I replied, and meant it completely. The woman who'd sat in that restaurant a year ago, gathering evidence and planning strategic responses, had been preparing for more than just one evening's confrontation. She'd been preparing for a completely different life, one based on truth, self-respect, and the understanding that sometimes the most dangerous person in any room is the one everyone underestimates. The future stretched ahead, full of possibilities that belonged entirely to me. And for the first time in years, that felt like the greatest gift imaginable.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.